So let's start. It's time to start. I would like to introduce you to Aaron. Aaron really doesn't need an introduction because we have to introduce, for example, Carlo Simonelli and explain to people who Carlo is. I think that everyone that has only a little knowledge about sports science knows perfectly who Aaron Coutts is.
Well, hi everyone. Thank you for the invitation to talk. Good opportunity with the world in lockdown to do some education. So hopefully you find this short presentation valuable. I have 25 minutes to talk to you about athlete monitoring. What I thought I could do in 25 minutes would be give you a background of the theoretical basis. It's always good to examine the basis of what we're doing, but also give you a critical review of current practical application of the methods and tools that we use in athlete monitoring. So the three things I want to do today is talk about the conceptual basis, critically review the tools, and give you some discussion around future perspectives. The real purpose of athlete monitoring, as many of you will be aware, is to understand athletes better so we can inform our prescription of training. Finally, with the goal of improving readiness to perform, so getting our athletes ready to perform at the right time, hopefully reducing injury risk. And to do that, we really need to understand the dose-response outcome of training outcome at the individual level of the athlete. And that would be great if we could achieve that. Now, the conceptual monitoring basis for athlete monitoring systems goes back into the 1970s from work, the Bannister's impulse response model, which many of you may know as the fitness fatigue model. And this is some fundamental modelling work that's modelled the fitness and fatigue and performance responses from a training dose. So simply what that means is if you have a training dose, we will have a fatigue effect. Immediately we feel fatigued when we train, we know that. But we also get a fitness effect. And these both have different decay rates. So they accumulate and decay at different rates. And our performance outcome from a training dose can be demonstrated as a simple rule or a function of our performance has been modelled as our fitness, our current fitness state, minus our fatigue state. Now, if we apply that over a training program, and I've got an example model here where you see a period of intense training followed by a period of less dense training, then a period of no training at all. And what we can see using that simple model is that the fitness fatigue model is that fatigue accumulates quickly during periods of intense volumes of training. Fitness also accumulates, but we may be aware that at the end of hard training, periods of hard training, that our performance may not be so high due to the effect of the remaining fatigue. But fortunately, with rest, fatigue decays quicker than fitness, and then we get super compensation in performance. And this is the fundamental theoretical basis for any athlete monitoring system. And now to control fitness and fatigue outcomes, we need to control the training dose. And the training dose is therefore the foundation of any athlete monitoring system because it modulates, we need to control our training and our recovery. And that, if we get that right, we can hopefully get some understanding and control of athlete readiness to perform and also hopefully injury risk. And I suppose this is just guiding fundamental training periodization. Now, therefore, if training load is important, we need to understand what the definition of training load is. And it's very simple, and I'm sure you are all aware of this. Training load is a function of the duration or volume of training and some measure of intensity. There is no one measure of training load. There are many, many, many constructs of training load that we can use, and we should choose the construct of training load that best relates to the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Now, some great research and papers that come from Italy really describe this really nicely. There's different types of training load. In particular, there's the external training load. And I like to think of this.
Aaron, sorry to interrupt, Carlo. We don't see your slides. Yes, we do now.
Okay. So just to give you a quick overview, they're the fitness and fatigue effect to a single bout is the equation of fitness and fatigue. And then we have the dose response training over a longer period. And you can see with the period of dense training where we get the fatigue effect and the fitness effect. And when there's less dense training, that fatigue effect decays and the fitness remains, and therefore we get a super compensation in performance. So therefore, we need to control our training load. Now, training load is a simple product of volume and intensity. And then really basic foundation understanding of training load is that there's various constructs of training load that we need to understand. And really importantly is the external training load. And that I try to think of that as a training load that we have done, or the work that we have done. Now, all of us can do the same training load session, but based on the periodization and our individual characteristics, we will get a different internal training load response. So external training load and internal training load are different measures and have different purposes. And for athlete monitoring, external training load is important for planning training, and internal training load is important to monitor for understanding the outcomes of training, because that is what gives us our fitness and fatigue effect. And that's what relates to our training outcome. Now, to make that even more complex, training load, internal and external load, have different measures. There can be physiological and biomechanical markers of either internal and external training load, and each of these have different adaptation rates and different, I suppose, decay rates. And therefore, the challenge for the coach, the challenge for the strength and conditioning coach, is to apply these loads in an appropriate way that gets the outcomes that we want. It doesn't break the system. And that's where monitoring these, and some of these, the ones that you would measure would be the ones that relate to the outcome measures you're most interested in. They're the ones that need to be controlled. So there's a very simple framework that we've put these measures into to describe the process of monitoring. Like all athlete preparation, we need to understand to solve for performance. And to do that, we need to understand the determinants of performance for any particular sport or any position or any particular athlete. That's what sets our training goals. Now, our training goals will then dictate what exercises we choose to do, and then we will choose to periodize those in terms of prescribe those exercises in a way that gives us a specific external training load. That external training load will then modulate in individuals differently to give an internal load, and that will depend on various characteristics, individual characteristics of the athlete. And that's what gives us the training outcome or the adaptations. Now, in monitoring, what we do is we set our goals, we measure what we do as we go, we assess our training outcomes, and depending on how they change, we will make adaptations back on our training prescription. So that's a training process framework that we can use to guide our athlete monitoring systems. Now, for training load and performance, there's two phases. There's a planning phase and the implementing phase. In the planning phase, we'd write the training plan to target the physiological goals that will hit the performance limitations for our athlete. And to do that, we write our training program. And then when we implement that, we fundamentally will measure the load, we'll measure the athlete response, and hopefully see how they use process control and hope that they are targeting those goals. And we'll apply those using established training principles. Now, for injury, it's similar, but not the same. We've got the individual athlete, and each individual athlete has different physiology, which will determine the structure strength of their body. Now, we will apply exercise to apply strain and stress on those structures. Now, hopefully that stress and strain will lead to an adaptive response, and that adaptive response will then affect the individual's physiology. However, if we get our training prescription wrong and we give too much stress and strain for the specific strength of the athlete, we may injure or break the athlete. So we use this conceptual framework when we're monitoring for injury. So very similar to before. However, what we're solving for is to apply the stress and strain specific to the strength of the individual structures of the athlete. So that's a fundamental theoretical basis. Now, to keep that more simple, what happens in practice is a coach will write a training plan. We will measure the dose of training. Now, that dose of training, which is the internal training load, will give a response. We can measure that response as fitness and fatigue, and that should mediate in some kind of performance outcome. If we can control this process of training, we should have some understanding, a better understanding of likely performance outcomes. Additionally, we should be able to control some risk of injury. And this is done on a daily basis in an iterative feedback loop. So the summary of the background is that fitness and fatigue model is the conceptual basis for athlete monitoring. However, there are non-linear relationships between load, performance, and injury. The load-response relationships aren't the same for all tissues or fitness characteristics. Therefore, controlling and understanding those are really important. To do that, if we want to use an evidence-based approach, we need to use valid indicators of load. We can use a training process framework to guide that. And so therefore, we'll move on the next part of the presentation is to talk about what the training load measures are. So in particular, those two highlighted in red, the external load, which is, I suppose, the training plan, and the dose is the response to that delivered training. Now, compared when I started working this field over 20 years ago, it was very difficult to measure the external load. Now, with the explosion in microtechnology, there's wearable devices, there's tracking devices that we can measure the external load, which much more ease than we could before. Now, these sensors, there's various sensors in these devices, which give us many different metrics. Now, those are measures. Those measures can be contrived into different metrics using different algorithms. And so because of the explosion in technology, it's easy to now measure external load. However, I must say, when you use external load, the first thing you should understand, is it valid and is it reliable? That is, does it measure what it says it measures? And does it measure it with accurate precision? But external load now is easy to measure in football, and obviously the wearable technology has made that easy. Now, the internal load can be measured by something like heart rate, and I'm sure you're all aware of that. Probably the most popular method, however, and most practical method is the internal training load, which is the session RPE method. It's probably the most common used one and in my opinion, the most valuable one to apply in football. Now, that's simply asking athletes after a workout, how intense was your workout, using a scale, hopefully a validated scale, the RPE scale. And this was originally developed by Professor Cole Foster from the USA. Now, we get a measure of intensity from the RPE, and the volume is just the duration. And therefore, a training load that was hard, using a scale, would be 5. So the intensity was a 5, the duration was a 40. So a hard session of 40 minutes would be 200 units. Now, internal training load is easy to measure. It's been validated for many, many different tasks, and it's been validated also against different gold standard methods. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is a very good method of measuring internal load when done properly. However, when it's not done properly, i.e. done not using the right tools or the right methods, again, the information may not be useful. So I've got a good picture there of one of my friends who's working in the NBA, or was working in the NBA, using the wrong method. Now, what I mean by that, he's using a coloured scale. If you write RPE into Google Images, you'll find all of these different scales. Now, I see this at many different football clubs and sports organisations I go around with these many different non-validated scales of RPE. So if you choose to use RPE, which you should choose the validated scales. And Borg session RPE scales are probably the ones that I would recommend. And I also recommend that you follow using the instructions. So what I've described so far is the load measures can be either the external load or the internal load. So that's the theoretical basis. What is actually used in football? There's a study completed a couple of years ago, was published out of Qatar, but it examined 41 football teams and asked them what load measures did they use for training and in matches. And what we can see in the top bar there, or top panel, is the measures of training load used in training, and the bottom is in matches. And what's surprising is that the same measures aren't used in training and matches. And if you're going to monitor training, you need to get a complete picture of all the training they do. So it's very clear there that time motion analysis is the most popular and used measure to quantify training load in football. It's the external training load. Now, the theory would suggest that for monitoring, the internal training load may be the most relevant. So that's the most popular methods. And of the measures that are used, the top 10 measures, you can see both in training in the top panel and matches in the bottom panel. The external load measures, again, are the popular ones, the most used measures. Now, the internal load doesn't really come into it very much at all. So that may be because it's easier to use external load. Another concern from this study was many of the measures that are popular were the least reliable measures. So some of the common measures are not popular, are not valid, or are least valid for monitoring and least reliable. And that's a concern for me. Additionally, if we look at what the research is about how confidently can we use these load measures to model injury and performance. There's 2 systematic reviews, one in football specifically, looking at 2 studies, and 12 studies. And if we look at the conclusion there, basically they came to the conclusion after looking at all the available literature that despite the availability of these measures, there's a high level evidence regarding their relevance in using injury and illness. And in team sports, not just football alone, another systematic review analysed the studies of 26 studies and found that there was consistent evidence supporting the association between external load and performance outcomes. There was little consistent evidence supporting the relationship between training load and performance outcomes, and also performance-related statistics. So despite many of us using this, the research is yet to show that there's a great relationship from training load alone and illness, injury, and performance in team sports. Okay, so that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. We should be aware, though, of the evidence supporting what we do. We recently did a study applying Bannister's model to team sport, not to soccer, but to rugby sevens. We had the National Australian Rugby Sevens team, over 2 years of data, and we applied Bannister's model to try to predict the relationship between training load. In this case, we used GPS external load, and we tried to model against performance. And in the blue box there are correlation coefficients. And those correlation coefficients show only a moderate relationship between modelled predicted performance using Bannister's model and actual performance. Similarly, we looked at the models predicting fitness, and there was absolutely no relationship of using Bannister's model for predicting fitness. Similarly, for using fatigue, again, there was no relationship there. So whilst I said the fitness fatigue model is a conceptual basis, if you apply it strictly, there is little evidence, again, to say that we can predict things from this model. We shouldn't use it to predict. It's a little bit of a black box still. And so therefore, we still need to go to other solutions, such as using expert opinion and common sense in making decisions around training using well-established measures. The other area we use athlete monitoring for, and has been very popular in the last few years, is around predicting injury. Again, the fitness fatigue model has been used as the basis. And the most common measure used here is the acute to chronic workload ratio, which again uses a fitness and fatigue model. Fundamentally, the acute to chronic workload ratio is just an adjustment of the fitness fatigue measure, where they use the 7-day training load as a fatigue measure and the average 7-day training load over the previous 28 days as the fitness measure. However, even though we've used a 7-day for the acute and the 28 days for the chronic, if we look at the original research, it doesn't match to just 7 and 28 days. The acute load can be anywhere from 5 to 21 days for fatigue and anywhere between 30 to 50 days for the fitness decay rates. So it's only used as an indicator, I suppose. And how we might calculate that very quickly is that when we get an injury or an event, our acute load is a training load for the previous week. The chronic load is the average of the 4 weeks leading into the event. So the acute to chronic workload ratio for this example here would be 0.93, where the acute load is 1,400 units and the chronic load on average over that 4-week period was 1,500 units. So it's a very simple equation. It's become very popular, and most athlete monitoring systems that I see around the world in the last few years have incorporated this. The reason it's incorporated this is this very famous graph here that shows a sweet spot. If once your training load increases above 50% of what you've averaged over the last 4 weeks, it's been suggested there's a danger for injury risk. They've also suggested there's a sweet spot for training load. If you don't change it too much from what you've done previously, your risk of injury is lower. Now, this has been approved by very esteemed journals. The original work has been replicated in some respects in a number of team sports, where they've all shown associations between load and injury. And when this occurred, this research appeared, we all jumped on it and we said, this looks like to be a good measure. However, I've only got a few minutes to cover this. We've been working over the last few years looking at this in much, much more detail. And if you don't follow Franco and Pellizzeri on Twitter, you should. You'll get to look at some of these issues in much more detail. There's many issues with the research that's been done in this area that lacks consistency. There's also been some methodological issues that underpin the confidence that we have in this measure. For example, the studies all use different training load measures. They use different time methods, time windows for acute and chronic periods. The statistical analysis is not appropriate. The definitions of injury are different. They used association in place of prediction. And there's many, many other issues. And that's probably another 1 hour presentation to go into this issue. But however, based on the issues, we've written a letter for retraction, and we have about 5 or 6 papers coming out in the next few months demonstrating the issues in the acute to chronic workload ratio. But if you want to learn more about it, follow Franco on Twitter or read this paper, and we'll have a few papers coming out sooner that demonstrate some of the issues in the acute to chronic workload ratio. So my recommendation, based on the best available evidence, is that we're not looking for injury. We may be looking for unicorns in the acute to chronic workload ratio, and I wouldn't recommend using it for predicting injury risk. So the summary of training load is that there is some conceptual support for using both internal and external load, with a preference for internal load for monitoring athletes' outcomes. Practitioners prefer using external loads. However, the acute to chronic workload ratio is fundamentally flawed for predicting injury, so I would avoid using that. But we still require better evidence and better studies to overcome these issues. Now, the second part of any athlete monitoring system is looking at the response measures. Common response measures are objective response measures. So these are the measures we take on a weekly or daily basis to see how our athletes are coping with training. Heart rate, blood measures, neuromuscular screening have all been popular, and we've tried all of these with relatively little success. And a study, again, that looked at what's used in practice shows that hardly any professional teams use these measures, these heart rate, blood measures, or standardised training drills. What is popular, however, is athlete self-report measures, questionnaires. This maybe replaces or complements what an athlete does in terms of talking to their athletes, asking them how they feel. There's many questionnaires available. Most of them have been manipulated and homemade versions, but there are questions available. There has been an excellent systematic review that examined how well they report, they respond to training load. And the summary of this systematic review from Anna Saw in British Journal of Sport Medicine shows that the subjective measures are better than the objective measures for measuring the athlete response. And briefly, this study here just compared the objective with the subjective measures, and the shaded boxes show strong relationships. And what you could see was there's very poor relationships with outcome measures with the objective measures, where on the right-hand panel, you can see the subjective measures had much better, stronger relationships. So the recommendation was to use subjective measures for monitoring. However, the concern with these athlete self-report measures is that most of the ones that are used in practice have not been validated for sport. Annie, who you can see the picture down on the slides here, is one of our PhD students who's just submitted this paper. It took her over a year to do. She looked at 15,000 papers, and basically we assessed what measures were being used in sport and sport research, and we found that most of them did not have the appropriate measurement characteristics, so they haven't been developed using appropriate valid methods. So most tools that are used using self-report are not being validated for athletes, and we have many concerns over their measurement properties. So what we need to do in the future is to develop our own based on proper psychometric principles. Make sure they're validated, they're reliable, they're assessed for their sensitivity and responsiveness, and also they're feasible to be applied in practice. So the summary of the athlete report measures is that they trump the objective measures. Don't worry too much about the objective hormonal measures, heart rate variability measures. They tend to be much more complex and invasive on athletes, and possibly less evidence supporting them. So what are the solutions? So far, I've told you that the models aren't as precise as we hope. The tools have some errors in them. So what are the solutions? Well, the solutions, I suppose, go back to what we've done always, where we use collective decision-making based on expert plans from coaches, monitor using the best available tools that we have, and hopefully allowing the athletes to perform and measuring their performance regularly. And by having regular good information feeding back, we can make good decisions that can inform planning. However, don't expect to be able to predict outcomes with extreme confidence. It's used as a heuristic and to guide the process of training. The better we measure it, the better we can understand it. And if we can understand it, we've got better control of our outcomes. However, embrace the uncertainty. Don't look for magic solutions. The simple model that we've used in the teams that I've worked with is fundamentally we measure the physical load, but that load is always set by the coach. The coach sets the load based on the tactics they want to play and what skills they want to learn. We simply measure the load, and once we measure the load that we're doing, over time we'll be able to get a good estimation of what the coach is planning, and then when we can make sure that the load is distributed over the week sensibly, so they've allowed for appropriate periodization. We can also measure when the plan isn't implemented as intended, and that's where something can go awry or we can have a problem. And what we do, we adjust individual athlete scores based on their self-response, their athlete self-report measures like soreness and fatigue. We have medical screening and we get experts feedback from the fitness coaches, medical staff, and the head coach, of course. And that's a simple model that we use, and it's not more complicated or sophisticated than that. So for me, the next steps are getting the basics right. Despite doing athlete monitoring for many decades now, we still see many errors. Many of the tools we use, we don't understand the noise in. Some of the tools we use haven't been validated yet. And despite the increased monitoring, we don't see injury rates decreasing. We may have some evidence performance is increasing, but injury rates definitely aren't decreasing. I also have some concerns of over-monitoring, where monitoring can reduce coach learning and athlete self-regulation. So we should also be concerned about the over-monitoring. I like to apply the keep it simple, stupid policy, or the KISS policy in monitoring. Choose the tools that are valid and reliable, that are easy to do, and not overly invasive. And what tools you use them confidently and use them appropriately. So my last slide is the fitness and fatigue and the training process framework are the fundamentals of training. There's still little high-level evidence between training load, performance, and injury. The proposed models can't be used to predict performance and injury of confidence in team sports. Despite stronger evidence for internal load, we're still choosing the external load. And the self-report measures are useful, but we need to do more work on having valid measures. So users should be aware. You also should be aware of using contrived measures and metrics, and don't trust black boxes approaches. Training is complex. We need to embrace the uncertainty and use good clinical decision-making skills of experts to achieve the best outcomes for monitoring.
Fine, Aaron, thank you. Okay, that's perfect, fine. And thank you for being quick instead of our connection problem and technical problem.